Good morning, everyone. My name is Chris J from Bascule Disability Training. I am a wheelchair user, something which you can't see when I sit behind this desk. But because the microphone is here, I will now go back here and get into position. Okay, can I just check that everybody can hear me? Perfect, the thing's working. So today we're going to be talking about some barriers to recruitment and retention of people with disability and or neurodiversity. And the reason I put in and or is because they are actually quite different. But some of the solutions we're going to be coming up with are quite similar. So, that unfortunate chap on the screen, that for those of you that can see it, I will be describing the slides as well for anybody who perhaps has a visual impairment and perhaps will not be able to see the screen. So that is an unfortunate mugshot of me on the right-hand side. So my name is Chris J. I am 37 years old and I am Managing Director of Bascule Disability Training. I was born with cerebral palsy, okay, so I've had a disability all my life. I have a master's degree in global security and an undergraduate degree in politics, all of which does absolutely nothing help me run my own small business, but apparently people still like to know that I have some kind of qualification. I went to a mainstream school with a special support unit attached to it, and that's a school effectively where there is a building where a team of people work out of to help those with disabilities access the mainstream curriculum, or providing reasonable adjustment for students, if you will. And the reason I mention that is because it fundamentally informs my philosophy and the way that I work. I'm a governor of an independent school in Chichester. I'm a member of the Worshipful Company of Educators, one of the London liveries. I'm a trustee of a charitable trust. So I get around. I like to think I've got some experience that I can share. So Bascule Disability Training, our motto is building bridges between policy, people and inclusive practice. And if my diagram works, you'll then see a bridge going up and down. A Bascule bridge is a kind of drawbridge, okay? So because 67% of the British population feel uncomfortable talking to people with disabilities, the drawbridge is up, and my job is to bring it down. And we then use our profits from that to do free workshops for children in schools to raise awareness. Now, I want to do a quick terminology check. As I said, disability and neurodiversity are not the same thing, and it's not the intention of the presentation to treat them as such, but some of the things you might like to use to remove barriers and improve inclusion are the same and can work across multiple groups. So, to make sure everybody's on the same page, from the Equality Act, a definition of diversity. A person has to have a physical or mental impairment. In this case, impairment is synonymous with the term disability, and the impairment has to have a substantial and adverse effect on somebody's ability to perform normal day-to-day activities. So long-term means more than 12 months. There are special rules covering fluctuating conditions, and normal day-to-day activities include things like washing, going to the shops, and things like that. Neurodiversity is not so well defined. So I've taken one definition from the NHS in Oxfordshire, which I quite like, which is neurodiversity is a term to describe a variation in normal human evolution, which means some people think differently to others. Neurodiverse conditions include autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and complex tic disorders. Now, I've included one just to make sure everybody's on the same page, but fundamentally, there is no real set agreement on entirely what neurodiversity encompasses. So a few basic population stats then. I like my big diagrams. There are 13 million people in the UK with disabilities. That's about 20% of the population. That effectively doubles to nearly 40% though if you include long-term health conditions. And the reason I think long-term health conditions are so important is because anybody with a long-term health condition could be coming to you seeking reasonable adjustment in the workplace. And one of the things we're going to go on to talk about is how important culture is. And I'm often asked, is my training pan disability? Well, my answer is it kind of is and it isn't. It is that we talk about a variety of different disabilities, but ultimately what's important is the needs of the individual, and therefore you need to create an environment where those conversations can take place. Of the original 13 million though, only 10% are wheelchair users. I think that's really important that I fall into the minority, and we point that out because what that effectively means is 90% of disabilities can be hidden from view. Okay, moving on to neurodiversity, there are hugely different variations on what people think that the amount of the population is who might be neurodiverse. Some put it at 15%, other estimates put it to 30 to 40%. Again, I suspect that depends on the kind of definition you use. I also just want to focus a little bit on the business case and why it's so important to focus on people with disabilities and neurodiversity, because as a group we represent £275 billion a year after housing costs and from families. Okay, why do I include families as well? To be blunt, if you upset someone with a disability because of your poor practice, no one in their entire family is going to be back and you are going to be done with that family. And one of my key frustrations has always been, when I was a kid, Saturday morning children's television, okay, the adverts were for Super Nintendo games, Polly in Your Pocket, Barbie dolls, trips to Thorpe Park. Morally repugnant it may be, but we successfully marketed to the groups who were watching those programs. During the last Paralympics, did anybody see, I don't know, any adverts for any walk-in baths, or new wheelchairs, or accessible holidays? And if you're wondering what the answer is, it's no. So the fact that we don't target certain groups, I find really frustrating. And the purple pound, £2 billion a month is lost by businesses because people with disabilities walk away from organisations that are not disability smart. And 63% of customers want companies to take a stand on the social, cultural, environmental and political issues that matter to them. Roughly translated, whether you believe in the term woke or not, people expect the organisations they buy from to stand for something. And despite all of this, 53% of people in the workplace report bullying because of their differences. So what are some of the barriers and sort of why do they exist? So the biggest barrier for me has always been fear. There's a huge discrepancy between the number of people in organisations who disclose a disability and the likely number of people that there are. With the corporates I work with, you're looking at a disclosure rate of between 2.5% and 8%. Well, if 40% of the population have long-term health conditions and disabilities, that is a huge gap between what's likely existing in the workforce and disclosure. And I think people with disabilities fear what happens when they're disclosed, but 47% of businesses said it would help if job applicants were more blunt about what they actually needed. And this is what it comes down to. We have to break down barriers on both sides. And almost a third of businesses were worried that if they tried to employ people with disabilities and something about it went pear-shaped, that they'd get landed with some kind of discrimination case. And the whole point of reasonable adjustment is to level the playing field. Okay? It's to remove the negative aspects of having a disability, or to find a way to allow them to work as well as they can with the neurodiversity that they have. If you remove those barriers and they're still, to be blunt, crap at their job, then you can still fire them. But people don't understand that. 10% of businesses feel that they cannot support an employee with a disability, and around a quarter of respondents said it was challenging to discuss management of disabilities. So there's real fear amongst line managers too. So this fear is a barrier that we have to try and fix. Second barrier for me is a huge lack of knowledge. It flashed. and then it disappeared. That's very odd. The first thing for me, discrimination does not have to be a deliberate act of malice. It's not, no, we don't serve your type in here, get out. There are other forms of discrimination. Discrimination by association. So let's say we've got two candidates going for a job. We've got Bob and we've got Jane, and Bob has a child with significant SEND needs, and the manager trying to be friendly, thinking, oh, this job, you know, it involves a lot of driving, it's going to be very difficult for him, I'll give the job to Jane instead. Congratulations, he's just brought an Equality Act claim on himself. By trying to be nice, he is actually discriminated against Bob. Discrimination by perception is the other one. My colleague Spencer is hiding at the back somewhere. I can randomly decide that Spencer has a neurodiverse condition of some kind, and I'm going to try and start treating him differently because of that. Whether he's neurodiverse or he's not is irrelevant. The fact that I'm treating him differently because of that is problematic. And as we've already said, 90% of disabilities can be hidden. Individuals who are neurodiverse may have never received a diagnosis. They may never know that they're neurodiverse. And the emphasis is always on the individual to seek adjustment. Okay, this is one of my big frustrations. Access to work, what's always laughingly called the government's best kept secret, relies on the individual to seek the adjustment. Now, having gone through personal independence payments, as someone who I like to think is reasonably intelligent, those forms are hell on earth. So the barriers we put up in making these things difficult are really problematic, which then leaves us with this other inappropriate thing of line managers trying to label their staff. Good God, no. Again, for the same reasons of labeling people, you mustn't do that. Which overall brings us to what I like to call the psychic problem. And the reason I call it the psychic problem is because, to the best of my knowledge, is anybody in here psychic? I would doubt it. How the hell are you supposed to figure out whether your staff need reasonable adjustment or not? You can't. It has to be a joint process. You can't read people's minds. You can't read their train of thought. So it's got to be this joint process. Now, for me, the chief solution to this, moving on to solutions, because I only like talking about problems for so long, is around cultural change. Now, ultimately, it's going to sound self-serving because Bascule disability training, it is kind of in the name, we offer disability awareness training, but all staff in an organisation need disability awareness and neurodiversity training. Your organisation is only ever as good as your weakest link. And I'm going to give you a really good example from this morning. Spencer and I turned up downstairs at the front desk of this venue, and immediate apoplexy started. There's a wheelchair user here. Yeah, I'd like to go to the ETC venue. Wait here, we find someone, we'll take you there, wait here, don't move, wait here. And I could just see the poor man, I thought he was going to have a heart attack, quite frankly. But again, it just shows that unless you train all staff, doesn't matter how nice the staff at GovNet are, doesn't matter how good the rest of the staff are, first impressions matter, and they matter a lot. So we have to try and get that right. Disclosure, okay? This is such a terrible word, okay? You disclose a positive COVID test. You disclose an affair, okay? Disclosure is a negative word. You're telling someone bad. And you've got to try and get an organisation to a stage through training where it is okay to disclose and it's okay to talk about it. I want you to completely reframe it. And I want you to banish the word disclosure and change it to allowing all staff to bring the best version of themselves to the workplace. As this idea of disclosure implies that something negative is going to happen as a result of talking about it. Now, I try to avoid shameless self-promotion, but I wanted this one quote up here that I wanted to read from one of my most important bits of work, and it's from Jennifer Carter, who's a former UK HR manager at Critical Software. Disability may be a serious subject, but Chris humanises it and makes it relatable to everybody. Thank you, Jennifer. We were very pleased to find out that shortly after the training, a staff member felt comfortable enough to come to me and disclose the fact that they had a hidden disability for the first time. So I'm not just using this to blow smoke. It is simply that through training, people believe that organisations take it seriously, and then people will come forward seeking reasonable adjustment. Okay? Some other things for me on cultural change then. Training is not enough in and of itself. You need a steering group around disability and neurodiversity separately if possible. By all means, have them work together, but do not lump them together. And the really important reason for it is this. We know that disability has set criteria and has to have a substantial and adverse effect on someone's ability to perform normal day-to-day activities. Some neurodiverse conditions in some individuals may very well meet that criteria. And I'm not saying there's not crossover between the two, because there is. But actually, not everybody who's neurodiverse considers themselves to have a disability. So it's really important that you balance the two. You need to gather experience from throughout your organisation, and this group needs access to senior management. In an ideal world, you'd have a member of senior management on the panel. And in an ideal world, there would be someone with a disability or who was openly neurodiverse in senior management, and so therefore you could fill both roles. On top of that, speaking as someone with a disability who's never really quite felt that these things, these positive steps ever really applied to me, it's always about other people but not me, staff who are open about their disabilities, you really need to try and get them to do a case study. You need to help them work with your organisation and say, hey, my name is Chris, I have cerebral palsy, I worked for company X and they were really fantastic and they got me reasonable adjustment A, B and C. I'm really pleased that I went forward and told my line manager or HR about my need for reasonable adjustment. Okay? Because that then provides examples to other people. And on top of that, where possible, even if it needs to be anonymised, I want you to make that publicly available. Because this will circle back to recruitment later on. Because again, when we look at recruitment, again, don't really feel, well, they say all these things, but does it really apply to me? Okay, we've all been turned down enough and have had enough difficulties that we need you to be really bloody obvious that you mean us. Yes, you. And I think that's why it's so important. Communication. This is one of the first times that I have delivered in person since the pandemic, and I'm loving it. Not only because I'm high on adrenaline right now because of my performance anxiety, but also because I can read faces. I can see what people are doing. I can see whether people are paying attention. I can see that Spencer's on his phone at the back because he's not paying attention to me. And that's fine. But I can actually read the room. And we don't ever really think about how important it is to be able to read the room. And we know that communication is the key to every business and interpersonal transaction. And we know intellectually that communication involves a wide range of experiences apart from the spoken word. Professor Maharabian is famously misquoted in the 1960s as only saying 7% of communication is verbal. What he actually said was that only 7% of communication was entirely verbal, with no other component. So if I think about the number of ways I'm communicating with you right now, I am speaking to you. It's not just my words, it's my tone of voice. I've started using my hands without realising it with counting, so I'm using body language, and I also have a PowerPoint deck that I'm using. So I'm using multiple different ways to communicate with you at the same time. And if there was anybody in the room with a visual impairment, I know it's quite tedious sometimes when people do read off their slides a bit, but I'm also wanting to make sure I don't miss anything, because I'm making an assumption that you can see that when perhaps you can't. And we have to acknowledge that everyone's communications needs are different. And we could spend hours on different forms of communication. But all I really want you to consider is the fact that not everybody communicates in exactly the same way you do. And I don't want to suddenly say, oh, you can no longer have any fun in the workplace. or anything like that. But we use double entendres, sexual innuendos, sarcastic voices. We use so many things that absolutely mean the opposite of what we've just said. And maybe, just maybe, for people that you don't know well, you should take responsibility for how your message is received as to how you intended it to be, by being clear and honest and giving proper feedback. Now, by all means, with the colleagues that you know well, and you want to be a bit jokey and do that, I understand. It's part of a functioning workplace. But just consider that people new you meet may have different communication needs to you, and just take responsibility for that. And it's also about, do you speak their language? Whenever I work with banks, I have a running joke where I'll ask, okay, who knows who in the room here speaks Farsi? And they'll point at someone. Okay, fantastic. Who speaks, in inverted commas, British Sign Language? Crickets, absolute silence. So it's making sure you understand what you have in the organisation that fits your needs. And also remember, and apologies, the font that I use for this presentation is not on this computer, so some of the words are disappearing off the screen there. Individuals themselves may very well struggle to describe their needs. So it needs to be a partnership, again, to make these things work. The line manager has an awful job. There's no two ways about it. It is not the job of the line manager to diagnose people themselves, and they absolutely should not do that. I've found what's best is to use coaching terminology, things like, I notice that a certain task seems to be causing you a bit of difficulty. How can we change it, or how can we make it easier, or how can we change the way that we do it so that it suits you? Okay, I could not give a damn about your organisation's processes. I want you to focus on outcomes. You want to achieve a piece of work done, you want it done in the most effective way possible. And that involves working with the individual. And you can use HR and occupational health as needed. Moving on to reasonable adjustment then, one of those greatly misunderstood terms. Know what your organisation already has in the way of stuff. You probably have pre-existing site licenses for various bits of software, screen readers and the like. You don't have to reinvent the wheel at every time, but know what options you've got. Understand that access to work exists and that there is support for the costs of otherwise prohibitively expensive reasonable adjustments. Now, the problem with access to work, as we've said, is the fact that it relies on people themselves to do the work. There's nothing to say you can't help them with the forms. Okay? Think logically about how you can support people. And even so, I was once told the average cost of a reasonable adjustment is just 75 quid. Okay, so it's not massive. For me, it would be a slightly taller desk and maybe a slightly raised keyboard. That would probably be the list for my reasonable adjustment. But you know what, occupational health might come along and say, Chris, this is terrible for your neck. We also need to do this. And these are the things that are beneficial to all of us. And I think what's really important, neither the line manager nor the individual themselves have to have the answer as to what the reasonable adjustment should be. You're not supposed to be the answer to all things. That's what occupational health is for, that's what external support organisations are for. You're just looking to identify something that you would like to try and improve, and then you can seek external help. You don't have to have all the answers. Moving on to retention then, sort of the last bit of the presentation, really for me, well, retention and then recruitment. Always be open to reassessment. Reasonable adjustments are never static. Needs change over time as jobs change over time. And if you provide the right kind of working environment, people will stay. And it's really important that you always train new staff in disability awareness, particularly new line managers, because they are going to be your first point of either success or failure. Okay, and we don't want failure, because failure can cost you on average about £33,000, which I believe is the average cost of a claim for disability discrimination under the Equality Act. But ultimately, if I consider my best friend, he has a visual impairment. He's worked at IBM since he left universities in 2007, 2008. He went there, they gave him a giant monitor and a giant laptop, and they have a local minibus that picks people up in the local area and takes them to the Hursley HQ. Now, he's a very intelligent bloke. He could go to a software startup and make a ton more money, but ultimately he will stay at IBM because they treat him good. Now, as a disability rights activist to some degree, I'm not a massive activist because I'm also on the side of businesses because we have to be reasonable, I want him to have the right to be as fickle as everyone else and go and get another job and then maybe jump back to IBM on a higher pay grade. But ultimately, I recognise that if you get people with disabilities right within your organisation, then you are going to keep them longer because you'll do it well. And I want you to assume that any performance issues you come up with a disability or some kind of neurodiversity are to do with an unmet reasonable adjustment need first. Now, I'm not saying you can't fire people who are poor performers, anything but if the culture is right, people can come to you first, and when something like this comes up, you can choose to do better. Now, just moving on finally to recruitment. I've said this before, make it really, really clear that you want me, yes, them, list disability and neurodiversity separately, list all of the other protected characteristics that you do work for. Be very clear that you're happy to discuss reasonable adjustment before the interview so that they can bring them best selves to the interview. And ensure that any of your documents, shiny PDFs and everything else are accessible to people with screen readers. The best joke I've heard this year, another friend of mine with a visual impairment, yeah, they had this great PDF form. You had to tick on the bottom of it to say if you wanted reasonable adjustment. The form wasn't accessible. Okay? Now, to me, that's funny because I work in this area and it makes me laugh, but ultimately it's tragic because it's a failed opportunity to gain a high-performing employee. And make sure your recruitment pages are plastered again with those case studies and things that I mentioned. Make it clear, show examples. Yes, we're not just saying we want you, but we can prove that we want you and we can do it well. Okay, final slide on recruitment then. You must think about the whole journey. Not just the interview, not just the job, but how can you help them set it up? So thinking about what's the paperwork, what's the traveling, what's the communication, the interview itself, the follow-up. You can offer a Zoom interview if you feel it's appropriate, but I will be annoyed with you if you choose a Zoom interview because, to be blunt, you can't be asked to do any better. Okay? So it's really important that you only use that as an offer. Do you offer a guaranteed interview scheme? If you do you know that you do? Do you know how to offer it? And yes, it's perfectly okay to turn down the guaranteed interview if you don't want it. And have a very clear person and job spec for everything you do, because we know in recruitment these days, you are quite within your rights to not select the individual with the disability or the neurodiversity, but you have to make damn sure that your person spec and job spec supports your choice, okay, which is why these things are so important. Last slide from me then on making judgments, okay? Always evaluate the person and not the label they have. You see a piece of paper, oh, we're gonna say again, I'm gonna pick on Spencer. Spencer has autism. He doesn't, but let's pretend he does. You know absolutely nothing about Spencer. You know nothing about his needs, him as an individual. Autism is a great example because it's a spectrum condition. That's what the full name we use is. You have to look at how it presents itself in each individual. And for someone like me with cerebral palsy, there are multiple different kinds of cerebral palsy. Okay, so again, that on a piece of paper doesn't help you. And the mental attitude towards the disability can also be very different. You might have been born with it and experienced negative attitudes your entire life, or you might have acquired it recently and it's quite a traumatic experience. So born with versus acquired are very different. So how can you help them? Well, you can help yourselves, like us on Facebook, add me on LinkedIn, tell your friend organisations about us. We're a social enterprise, so as I said, 75% of our profit goes to do free workshops for children in schools. Pop by our stand to save 50% on our next open course on October the 12th, which is a general open course that we run for anybody. Right, I'm going to shut up now and see if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Just a question really about the training. Do you sort of encourage people to mentor within the workplace? Is that better?
Yeah.
Do you encourage people to mentor within the workplace? I'm thinking of particularly people with learning difficulties or additional needs, because there is a real shortage of job coaches out there, and it's just another way of obviously being more inclusive and bringing people in at an entry level, because I don't know if anybody else felt, but there was no real talk of entry level at all in any of the previous conversations that we had in the other room.
I've come across such schemes before, and if they are run well, they are fantastic. If they are run badly, they are patronising and frustrating and will do more harm than good. I am a huge believer in role models, which is why I love the case studies and things like that. So I think to give people the opportunity to work alongside someone who has similar needs to them or who's been through similar things is hugely valuable. But when I did some work at a large bank some years ago, their disability mentoring scheme actually just came across as patronising. Oh, you'll get promoted if you work alongside this higher performing person. It's kind of the feeling behind it. So if you get the pitch right, then I think yes, it can be hugely valuable. Yeah. Oh, yes, you at the front. Sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. On those, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
On those case studies, do you have any sort of tips how to balance the sort of not to use them as a marketing tick box exercise, especially in big organisations, and actually use them for something that benefits?
For me, it will be about talking to them about why you want to do it. Nobody wants to be the token disabled person, far from it. And I know there's been a lot of talk recently about women in engineering and how those women in engineering who are used as poster childs for things like this. For me, I would want them on the recruitment pages, telling their personal stories and being shared internally. I would want it to be used there because it's there to encourage other people to apply. It's not there to make the organisation look good. What I would always say too is that the individual should always have the right to have it removed or changed if it's being used in a way that they don't like. But I think for me it's about where you place it, and it's having the conversation with them about why you want to do it. We want to encourage other people in the organisation to come forward. We want to recruit more people with disability within the organisation, and we want to use this as a tool to prove that we already do it and that we do it well. Yes, look back. We'll just wait for the microphone to make its way to you.
Thank you. Cheers. I know you've kind of touched upon it, and you gave a really good example of somebody who came forward and disclosed to their employer about a disability. But the figures you provided at the front, the disparity between actual disability rates versus those who disclose that are still concerning, obviously. How much of your work, or potentially, could your company work to kind of target that a little bit more, and to increase the confidence and for people to come forward with more disclosures, and how much? Yeah, I'm just wondering whether there's a link there.
There is massively a link. So there's a slide in my normal PowerPoint that I use. Does anybody in the room have a disability that they would be happy to talk about? And sometimes someone will put their hand up and they'll say, oh, I'll tell you, I'm dyslexic. I'll say, fantastic, thank you for sharing that. Does your line manager know? And the response is normally, oh God, no. And I was like, okay, can you just tell me why not? Okay, well, it doesn't really affect my ability to work. No. Okay, that's maybe fair, but could you get your workload done a little bit quicker? Could you seek that promotion that little bit quicker, rather than fighting your disability, and to use the old Churchillian phrase of buggering along? Could you not just become a bit more higher performing if you just took that little bit of reasonable adjustment. And I think for me, that's about how you do it. The reason I call it Bascule disability training and not some kind of disability enrichment, equality rubbish is because I basically want to sell it. I want to put a name on it that people recognise. But ultimately, my training is about culture. It's about encouraging people to open up and saying, look, by virtue of this organisation getting me in, and I'm very picky about who I work with, will you come in and do half an hour for us on disability? No, get lost. Minimum I'm going to do is an hour, and then I would expect to do some follow-ups to make it meaningful. So for me, if I'm doing it, if I feel I'm part of someone's tick box exercise, they get 2 things, quite frankly. It has to be meaningful to me, because I put my credibility in that. If I stand up for your organisation and deliver training for you, I better bloody well believe that you're going to take it seriously, because I place my credibility on that as well. Anybody else? Yeah. Okay. Shall I just take this last one and then? Okay. But I will be back at my stand in a few minutes, so I'll be very happy to answer more questions then.
Which one?
Yeah.
I think you might be on the stand, but I'm a career coach, so I work with students, I coach them into getting those roles. So obviously your slides are more about employers. Do you provide guidance for us as career coaches where we can support our students who have a disability?
I think for me, and I've been discussing this a fair bit today, what I would do with organisations such as yourself is, I'm sure you have a series of employers you work with on a regular basis. You've got your tame employers, I'm sure, and I would look to continually work with them to ensure that their staff are fully educated, so that the people that you send in don't experience negative attitudes. Because it's so important, particularly for young people with, significant needs, that they don't go into a workplace and they feel it's horrible and rubbish, and then they never want to go back. And so it's really important for me that we get that right. I will offer my brain to anybody, but I think I'm best placed working with staff in the organisations directly. So I will leave it there. Thank you ever so much for listening.